This is Voluminous, a listening books podcast for every kind of reader, but especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and I don't know if you've noticed, but it's getting darker and colder and maybe just a tiny bit spookier. So, for our very first episode, I thought we'd have a roundtable discussion on horror. The genre itself, and some of our favourite books and authors within that genre. So, with me around the table are Claire Bell. Hi, Claire.
Hello.
Tell me, what is it that you do here at Listening Books?
So I'm the Deputy Library and PR Manager, and I help the Library and PR Manager look after the members, the website, and make sure everything's running smoothly, and I also look after the volunteers as well.
So, indispensable.
Mostly.
Is how I would sum that up.
Yeah.
And I've also got Nick de Garis. Nick, did I say your name right?
Garis, but I won't hold it against you.
Sorry, Nick de Garis. And what do you do here at Listening Books?
I am the audio producer.
Yes, you are. Now, I want you to tell me a little about your relationships with the horror genre in general. Are you always up for a scary story, or does it have to be a particular kind? How do you and horror generally get on? I'm going to start with you, Claire.
Okay, so when you first asked me this question, I couldn't name any horror books that I'd ever read, ever, apart from Point Horror when I was about 12 or 13. But as I think back about it, I've actually read quite a few horror books and listened to quite a few audiobooks as well.
Is that because you didn't realise that some of those books were classified as horror, or is it just that they kind of slipped under the radar?
Yeah, definitely. I think how I kind of pictured horror books in my mind was something quite gory, quite scary, and I think that it's a much wider genre than I would have previously have thought. So
yeah, same here, I think. Yeah, what about you, Nick?
I think horror for me, I've still yet to venture further than Stephen King.
Yeah.
I really enjoy his writing, but I think I'm very slowly dipping a toe into horror beyond that, to be honest.
Yeah. I think at least with Stephen King, though, there's no questioning that that is the horror genre.
Oh, no, totally. It is right in the heart of it, because he does go for a lot of the fantastical, magical elements as well as more grounded stories as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm with Claire in that I didn't realize how many horror books I technically had read until I realized that even books like Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel could be considered horror books.
Yeah, which I never realised, and I've really enjoyed those books. So
yeah, I did too. But I mean, there is something sinister running along and underneath it. There's a sinister undercurrent, and there's certainly a hint of the mysterious and it's unsettling. But because it doesn't have that gore element, or an overtly supernatural element even. I mean, Rebecca, I suppose it is a bit ghosty, but it's not.
It is ghosty, but it's kind of a ghost that's imagined, that doesn't really exist. It's just the relationships between all the characters have created this ghostly person that's not having an actual influence, more of a perceived influence over.
Yeah, exactly. It's very psychological. And I'm very drawn to those kinds of books that are psychologically a little unsettling or that have that sinister element. But I would never have said that I was drawn to horror because I don't like being frightened, and that's how I think of the genre.
Yeah, I don't like jump scares when it comes to horror films.
It feels cheap, right?
It feels cheap, and I feel like I've been tricked rather than it's something genuinely scary. Whereas actually, talking about it, psychological horror, I read American Psycho.
Oh, of course.
A number of years ago, about 6 years ago.
Definitely counts.
Yeah, but in my head, it's not something I ever would have assumed was horror because it's set in the yuppie 80s of New York, and it doesn't have your typical werewolves or swinging pendulums or ghosts or anything like that to typify a horror.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no identifiable monster,
No.
so to speak.
No.
Yeah. Which leads me to ask, do you have clear markers in your minds as to what constitutes horror? What does it have to have? Any necessary elements? Can you draw a clear line between horror and, say, thriller? I love that collective intake of breath. That
I think it's quite difficult, and it gets more difficult as you read more. And you know, as I said before, I find it difficult to sometimes identify what genre a book belongs to.
Yeah. I'm sure. I definitely think there's overlap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think particularly with horror and thriller, I think for me anyway, what defines it between the two is a thriller's only ever really going to be grounded. For me, a thriller, when you think of a thriller film, it's like an action film, isn't it, basically?
Yeah.
When you think of a thriller book, I mean, like I said, I'm a big fan of Stephen King, so I would say something like Misery is a thriller rather than a horror.
Okay.
So it is a really scary and creepy and horrifying book, but it's the thrill of this character trying to escape from evil clutches rather than like a horrific element chasing someone. Maybe that's kind of what I'm getting at. In a horror, it's more about the main character being scared and being hunted.
You've got your finger on something, because it has to do, I think, with a thriller. Suspense is the key kind of reaction for the reader or the viewer if it's a film. Whereas with horror, I think, along with, because there will be suspense as well, but along with suspense is a sense of dread.
Yeah. And it's maybe more about the actions of what happens rather than wondering what might happen. So maybe if you think about something like Carrie, for example, Stephen King's first novel, it's all about the actions that Carrie takes out with her telekinetic powers as revenge. Whereas in a thriller, you don't know what's going to happen to the protagonist. You don't know how they're going to escape from this situation, or if they're going to escape from this situation.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, so what is it that we get out of horror? Like, why is it appealing to so many people?
I think you get a little bit of an adrenaline rush when you're reading it.
Yeah.
You get that you can be in the situation without being in the situation. And you can experience kind of those kind of chase feelings without physically being harmed. I think you can also marvel at why certain characters do certain things, and you think, I wouldn't do that in that situation. I wouldn't be running away. I
do think that is what... so it's obviously a bit of a different experience reading horror as opposed to seeing a film in a cinema. And there's something about wanting to shout at the person on the film, don't go in there, don't go, are you crazy, don't go to the basement. There's something like about that kind of collective reaction that I think is quite interesting, and how that differs with the book, where you don't have anybody to share the reaction with. Does that make it creepier?
Definitely. It's really isolating. You're following through with this character through this horrific thing of being chased by a monster or something like that, and it's just you on your own by lamp, normally for me anyway, in the dark. And even
in the
though
dark?
you know
Oh goodness!
You just made it worse for yourself to start with.
You go all in.
in for a penny, in for a pound. But you create that atmosphere as well. It being caught in that moment, which I think is the good sign of any book, regardless of genre, is you get caught up in that moment. And I think because of the extreme nature of horror, you're more inclined to get wrapped up in that book rather than, I don't know, I might not get so wrapped up in a period novel, for example, because it's just not my kind of thing. But because that horror is more extreme, it really draws me in and gets me lost in the moment.
Yeah. I have to say, I mean, generally, I'm not the kind of person to seek out a book in the horror area of the bookshop. But I do make a point every October to read at least one, because I think it's important to kind of stretch yourself beyond what you usually go for. It's important to me anyway to do that. So I always try to pick up something that maybe I wouldn't otherwise do. So last year I read Rosemary's Baby, and you've got this young couple who move in and they're going to have a baby, and they've got these supposedly very nice, friendly neighbors who, you know, turn out to be devil worshippers, and she's bearing the spawn of Satan. You know, I mean, it is so far out of my general like comfort zone, but I really enjoyed it. Which leads me to ask, what was the last horror book that each of you read?
I have just finished reading The Woman in Black.
Oh, that's a classic, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've been wanting to read it for ages, but I've kind of put it off. Because I'm like, do I want to be scared today? Not really.
Is it scary? Is it properly scary?
It is scary. More scary than I anticipated it would be. Because it's about this young solicitor, and he's sent off to this isolated house in the middle of a marsh, and there's this strange woman in black that keeps appearing, and none of the locals will talk about who she is and why she might be there, and they don't even acknowledge that they see her and stuff like that. So it was a lot more kind of psychologically frightening,
do you know,
than I would have thought.
Right there, I think, is one of the common elements of horror where you're not sure, where the protagonist anyway, the main character, is not sure whether they can trust themselves, whether they are actually going insane, or whether they are experiencing something real. It's like it's the horror of not being able to trust yourself, because nobody else will, as you say, like nobody will admit that they have seen her or will talk about her.
Yeah, it's like it isolates you quite a lot, because you're, am I going a bit mad? Am I seeing things? You know, is this an actual thing I should be scared of that I can fight back against or not? It's I really enjoyed it. Yeah. More than I thought I would, actually. It was quite a gripping.
I think that one might be one that I pick up next, because I have seen it a lot as a sort of classic of horror. It's by an English writer as well, right? Susan Hill?
By Susan Hill, yeah.
Mm. Yeah. And we have that in the Listening Books library,
we
don't
do, yes. Yeah. I definitely recommend it as if you, because it's quite a short book as well. If you want to kind of dip into to a horror book, then it's a good one to start with, I think.
But you did find it scary?
Yes, yeah.
And did you, like Nick, read it at nighttime in the dark by yourself?
No, I read it on the train, surrounded by people, in the morning or on the way home.
There wasn't anyone dressed in black, was there, on the train?
No, I didn't look up, to be honest.
Just in case.
I was like, I'll just keep reading. I would say it ended quite abruptly, so almost you didn't get that resolution of you know how you'd kill the monster, or you'd do something to kind of finalise it so it wouldn't happen again. It's got quite an interesting, scary twist at the end. So yeah,
I quite enjoy anything that has abrupt endings like that, where it's like either really open-ended or it just kind of stops and you're just left wondering. There's so many possibilities, and I like that authors don't follow up on that as well. Again, that's something that goes beyond horror, but I think it's a really fascinating element of just leaving you wanting more.
Yeah, I think sometimes I feel like authors do that to prepare you for the next book. With this, it's like, yeah, just nope. This is what's happening. This has happened, and you're not going to get any more of this story, which is quite frustrating, I think.
Mm. So, was it left in a way that you don't actually know either what happened or what was going to happen?
You know what happens.
Oh, okay.
But you want some kind of resolution.
Yeah. I mean, because sometimes, like, with my cousin Rachel, it's not what is going to happen that's left in question. It's what actually happened. Like, what did, was she malicious or was she innocent? And so you're not actually sure the story that you just heard. Like, what?
Yeah. You question everything that you've just listened to.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this one was about what was going to happen.
A load of things have happened. Then something happens at the end, which is a bit shocking.
Right. and we're not going to say because we're spoiler.
And I don't want to spoil the rest of it.
What about you, Nick? What was the last one you read?
I think the most recent one I've read, it's a bit sci-fi as well as horror, but I think I would still class it in the horror camp. I read George Orwell's 1984.
Do you know, I never would have thought of that in the horror genre, even though it is horrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe, I don't know, it's certainly sci-fi to agree. So it's written in 1949.
Yeah.
And for those who maybe don't know about it, firstly, I'd highly recommend checking it out. It was written by George Orwell in 1949, and it's definitely a reflection of his perception of a communist state. And it follows a character, Winston Smith, who is living in this free state, in commas, not in commas, in speech marks, run by Big Brother. So basically, Big Brother is watching you is the mantra, and everyone's zombies essentially. They're run by the government, completely brainwashed, and
yeah,
free
he is
thought.
saying zombie metaphorically. I should say, if you love zombie books, you might be disappointed reading 1984 because they're not literally zombies. They are.
Sorry, yes, but they're totally brainwashed to follow exactly what the government says, and they're monitored by the thought police, who basically, if you're not thinking party thoughts, you're taken away.
Yeah.
And Winston Smith is having rebellious thoughts, and it kind of goes from there. And when I read it, firstly, you make a lot of comparisons to today, and it was such like a distant, crazy idea at the time, I suppose. But it's horrifying in the way that he's treated just as a number, I suppose, is the best way to think about it, and tries to rebel. And then,
I mean, it's a dystopian novel, and one of the, I do remember moments of genuine horror reading it, because part of what it does is it gives you hope. You think the story is possibly going to go in a heroic direction, and then it yanks everything out from under you
completely
in a really horrifying way.
That's the perfect summary of it, in that you really, as a reader, you genuinely build up these hopes and these ideas of what might happen in the third act. And the big event that happens at the end of the second act of the story completely took the rug from under my feet when I was reading it. And I didn't know what to do with myself when I read that, because it was so not out of nowhere, but you didn't expect it to happen to your protagonist. And I don't know if that's just because they're the protagonist, they're the main character, rather than because it doesn't happen in this world.
Yeah, and I think the popularity of that book has surged recently.
Yeah, I would say it has.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading about this, that purchases of that book have gone up since, say November 2016. And I've seen it quoted a lot recently as well in social media. It definitely still resonates, and perhaps resonates even more in this particular time. And I think part of that is because even though Orwell might have been thinking of communism, the book itself, it depicts a totalitarian regime that could be any sort of economic, it's not the fact that it's communist, but the fact that it's totalitarian, which is what makes it so horrifying, because it is so intent on controlling truth, not just people, but actually what is true. And just, with this mindset that if you just keep repeating a lie,
it becomes the truth.
It becomes the truth, yeah.
Yeah. And that definitely resonates, I think.
Definitely, yeah. I think it'll be one of those in years to come. It will just keep resonating, and it will just come around in cycles again and again.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I'm glad you brought that one up, Nick. I'll think of that.
I've not read it. I'm going to have to read it now.
Oh yeah, you have to.
I've got Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle lined up next, which is another dystopian one.
To watch or to read?
To read.
I started watching it and then I thought I need to read this book.
Yeah, same.
That was scary, and that.
I'm aware.
A moment in history could just change everything completely.
I'm aware it's a similar kind of idea to 1984, but almost written by an American writer from an American perspective, based on more real things. So rather than it being some kind of otherworldly thing or person that's taken over your country, it's from the Second World War, where the not the Allied powers, sorry, the Axis, sorry, so Germany and Japan have taken over the world. So Japan,
and divided it between them, really.
And divided it between them, and now Japan run America. Which is fascinating. And Americans are treated as second-class citizens.
It's interesting in how it differs from 1984, I think, in that 1984, of course, at least at the time, was projecting an alternative future, what could be. Whereas The Man in the High Castle, that's looking at an alternative past, starting from the end of the war. So it's what could have been.
Yeah.
And they're both very interesting, but I mean, it's a real thought exercise to think, oh gosh, what would our world be like now had this trajectory happened instead of the other?
Yeah.
Well, you've given me two very alternative books in horror, and here I thought you were only going to talk about Stephen King.
I've not read any Stephen King.
Oh, well, you're missing out.
I have not read any Stephen King, and I feel like that's kind of shocking. Yeah,
I've got Dean Koontz.
Yeah,
and I can't remember the name of the book, but I've got that to read next.
So the funny thing is that even though I haven't read any Stephen King, the last horror book that I read, well, okay, technically not the very last, because I just finished Frankenstein, but I'm not going to talk about that today because I'm going to talk about that for an entire episode later. But the one that I read last year for my last, October horror read, I read it because Stephen King said it was a modern classic. And I mean, sometimes writers say that for the cover quote, and you think, but somehow the way that this was phrased, I thought, well, if Stephen King thinks that this is already like a modern classic, even though I have not read any Stephen King, I'm going to read this. And it was My Absolute Darling by Gabriel Talent.
Okay, I've not heard of that book.
Nor I.
Okay, well, we do have it in the Listening Books library. I checked, and I was a little surprised because it is quite recent. But we do have it, and it was. I read it very quickly, unusually for me because I usually wait till the book's been out for a while. But I read it straight away, and it was one where, again, because it had no supernatural element, I wasn't sure if it qualified as a horror. But I do think it does because it inspires a sense of horror and dread as you're reading it. If you like Stephen King and you trust Stephen King, then you might enjoy reading My Absolute Darling by Gabriel Talent. And I will say that even though at that point, and I suppose I should say what it's about, that it is about a father and daughter who live in a very isolated cabin, and he has taught her to be very self-reliant and independent, and they kind of live off the grid in a lot of ways, but that he's also physically and sexually abusive of her, and the horror that comes into it is that even though she doesn't want what's happening to her to happen to her, she's also struggling against her own love for him, even as she needs to escape from him. And it's very tense, it's very horrifying. But the thing that I remember most about it was how beautifully he wrote about the natural world. So anyway, if you like Stephen King and you want something that is not Stephen King to read, you might like My Absolute Darling. That's my recommendation for you, Nick.
Thank you. Sounds wonderful.
It brings up interesting points about what a monster is.
Yes.
Whether it's the actions of something that you do, or you're innately evil, or...
Yeah, what do you think makes an effective monster?
I think in my head, more the actions of... Because you can have very sympathetic monsters. Frankenstein from what I know of the book. I've not read the whole thing, but it's quite a sympathetic monster. You know, certain things have been done to him that, you know, he's in this situation through no fault of his own. Whereas a book like that you've just mentioned is a person that's, you know, thinking about their actions and going ahead and doing something and knowing potentially how horrific that will be for somebody else. So
yeah, I mean, in that case, it's a monster completely unmitigated by any redeeming qualities. What about you, Nick? What do you think makes an effective monster?
Well, I actually agree with Claire in that it's definitely the actions that you take. I was thinking about another example, or an interesting example would be Carrie, to come back to that story, where you have this girl with his powers who she does brutally murder a lot of teenagers, but you'd be hard pushed to describe her actually as the monster in the story. Well, maybe it's not actions. I think I've just kind of talked myself out of it. Because in that story, you've got an overbearing religious mother who's incredibly controlling and manipulative. And then you have the teenage bullies in the story who go to another level to harass and stick the knife and twist it in Carrie, essentially, to wind her up and make a fool out of her. I don't know, maybe they're all monsters. Maybe it's one of those where Carrie's lashed out and she's murdered all these people, so that probably makes her a monster as well, I suppose, in some ways.
Maybe that is the mark of one of the marks of a good monster, is for there to be that question mark over who the real monster is.
Is it Dr. Frankenstein or Frankenstein's monster? It's kind of...
Yeah.
Where's the start of...
Yeah, but I do like, Nick, how you had a little plot twist there where we thought we were going in one direction and actually...
changed your mind halfway.
Right, so I've asked you about the last horror book that you've read. Now I want to know, if you haven't already told me, what's the most memorable one? What's the one that really got to you?
The one that got to me more than any other story was It by Stephen King.
I'm never reading that. I've actually made a decision. From what everyone has told me, I will not be reading that.
It took me 3 years to read on and off. Because it's such a big book. And you're essentially reading two stories. So you might be familiar with the film. There's the Tim Curry film from 1990, and they've released the first half last year of a new version. And essentially it looks at this small town in Stephen King's favourite place of Maine. And there's this group of kids who realise that every 35 years or so, this creature that lives beneath the town feeds on children.
Oh, how charming.
And preys on children's worst nightmares, and parents don't notice that it's going on. So you've got that story of them as children trying to combat this creature, and then simultaneously you have them as adults coming back to the town about 35 years later because the creature started to strike again. And the way the story works is fascinating because you flash between the 1950s and the 1980s, and how the characters forget all their traits that made them them. And then as soon as they come back to the town, it all comes flooding back. Like a kid gets his stutter back and another one has asthma again.
Already
and things like that. But the fact that the iconic scene from the film of the little boy in the yellow rain mac with his boat, following it down to the drain.
That's the only bit I've seen.
And the clown is in the drain saying, "Hiya, Georgie." But that scene in the book is just as gripping as the film. You don't need to have ever seen the pictures for it to really grip you. And the creature is truly horrifying because it can take any form. It takes the form of your worst nightmares.
And see, that I think we've just touched upon another element of an effective monster as well, because you have no control over your nightmares. And for it to exploit something that you are ostensibly the cause of, but you have no control over. Do you know what I mean? Where you are...
Yeah, it's
like in a way that you're victimizing yourself because you were the one having the nightmares, but, you know, this monster is exploiting that. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I'm still not reading that book.
Well, I would recommend it because it's definitely... Stephen King has written a lot of great books. A lot of rubbish ones as well, but a lot of great books. But I would say it is one of his best.
Have any of you read any of the horror books that you've read? Have you experienced any of them as audiobooks?
Yes.
Ooh, what have you?
I Am Legend.
I Am Legend.
Which is...
Who wrote that again?
Richard Matheson, I think. But it's about this man he is the only human living man left in the world, we think. And everyone else, whether that's a man, woman or child, has been turned into a vampire.
Oh. I feel safer already.
So the kind of the more scary elements of that, obviously you've got this imminent threat every time the sun goes down, and he locks himself away and kind of waits and prays for sunrise because they are obviously always trying to get to him. But what makes it so much more interesting as an audiobook is you've obviously got a single person narrator, and it's that isolation of this is the only person left in the world, and you're potentially the only person left in the world. You've got no one to talk to. Everyone else is trying to kill you, or you think that they're trying to kill you and make them one of them, and it's kind of that choice between staying alive and alone or joining everyone else and kind of losing who you are and becoming a group. But as an audiobook, it works really, really well.
I think there's something as well. There's just something very, I don't know, is primal the right word? About it just brings you back to that tradition of telling ghost stories around a campfire. Let's say the electricity goes out, you're bored. What do you have to do? Let's tell a ghost story. There's something about that kind of intimacy with the audiobook and someone reading to you or somebody telling you the story that seems to kind of hark back to you.
Can I ask, Claire, because the book's so much about isolation, with an audiobook, it's normally someone talking to you through your ears. So does that isolation come across through the audio?
Yeah, for me, it definitely did. Because I think if I'm reading a book, then I've got my own voice in my head and I'm questioning things. Whereas, you can take a break almost. With the audiobook, it's, more of a constant. This is what I'm telling you my story. This is what's happening. And you don't almost have that opportunity to have your own voice in your head. So in that way, you're much more isolated.
Okay.
Which it scared me, but I also quite enjoyed. You felt more part of that world of it's just you and there's nothing else. What do you do?
Okay, one more question and then we're going to move on to a game. I want to know now, what have you got lined up? Anything you're keen to try? Do you want to venture out of Stephen King, Nick?
Well, I did mention that I've got The Man in the High Castle lined up.
Oh, that's right.
But I'd also... Many years ago, I tried to read Dracula and failed spectacularly.
It's on my list. I thought I need to try that again.
I think I found... I'm probably talking about 8 years ago now. I think I just found it too complicated to try and get into sat in bed. So I think now's the time to have another go at it. Because I know the language can be complicated, but I think I'm ready for a challenge. And there's something about it being a classic story. And I've never really actually watched a Dracula film. So I haven't
either, actually, no.
I feel that it's something I know all the tropes of, but I don't know the story. Yeah. So I'd really like to get stuck into that.
Yeah. And would you listen to it as an audiobook, do you think?
Definitely. That'd probably help me, actually. Probably help me understand it more easily and get into it. So maybe I'll try it as an audiobook rather than as print.
Yeah. That seems like a good strategy. And what about you, Claire? Have you got anything lined up?
I was going to reread The Girl with All the Gifts.
Oh.
Which is... I don't want to give too much away because it's got a bit of a twist to it. But it's about... you start off in this school and these children are led to their classroom. And they do that and then they go back to their rooms and that's how they seem to be living from day to day. And then as the story progresses, you learn more about who these children are and where their school is, and it's all quite mysterious and a bit creepy. And you think, who is the monster?
Speaking of who is the monster, we're going to play a game called Name That Monster. Maybe I should call it Who is the Monster? I have some anagrams for you, and I'm going to hand them out. Hear the paper rustling there. And I don't want you to take the word monster too literally, because it just we mean any of the bad guys, the baddies of famous horror novels. And we're going to start with Inns Weepy. And if you're listening, I'm going to play along. I'm going to spell that out for you. Inns, I-N-N-S, and Weepy, W-E-E-P-Y. Inns Weepy. Oh, actually, I've got to tell you what you're going to do instead of buzzing in, because we don't have a buzzer. So Nick is going to say boo.
Boo.
and Claire, should you know the answer, you're going to hiss. Okay. So I think Nick has already got our first one.
So boo.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Is it Pennywise?
It is definitely Pennywise. Yes, I figured you'd.
Is this
get
from
that
the
one.
book that I will not read?
Yes.
It is. Yes.
Should have called that coming.
That's from Stephen King's novel It. It is, of course, the name of the creepy clown. Okay, your second one. Okay. And by the way, you win nothing here. Like it's only glory. The second one is Bert, B-E-R-T, Dish, D-I-S-H. Bert, Dish. And I will start giving clues as we're going along to make it a little bit easier. It is 2 words, the answer. And it is the name of a short story by Daphne du Maurier, as well as a classic Hitchcock film.
Oh!
That's a big one. That was a big hit. Yes? Yes, Claire?
The Birds.
The Birds! You got it! Yay! All right, it's 1-1. Okay, next one. Cowman, that's C-O-W-M-A-N, Thinkable, T-H-I-N-K-A-B-L-E. Now, this one is it's 4 words, and I feel like the next clue is going to give it away. It is both a title and the character, and we did talk about it earlier. It is about a mysterious specter.
Boo.
Oh.
Is it The Woman in Black?
It is The Woman in Black. How did I not get that? Oh, that's shocking. Claire, where were you?
I even wrote it down and I couldn't work it out.
Okay, it's 2-1. Next one is Earns, E-A-R-N-S, Fink, F-I-N-K, Net, N-E-T. Earns, Fink, Net. And we're looking for 1 word.
Boo.
Oh, Nick, you are on a roll. What is it?
Frankenstein.
It is Frankenstein. Now, some would say that this is a cheat, because some would tell you that Frankenstein is not the name of the monster. It's the name of the scientist who created the monster. But there is a line in the book where Frankenstein's creature says, if I have any name, it must be Frankenstein. So it's actually the name of both. So I'm going to out-pedant the pedants there. Okay, I think Nick has won this one already, but we're going to do one more just for the sake of it, because I already did these anagrams, so we're going to play it.
And I need the practice.
Yes, Claire needs the practice. Okay, last one. Rhymed. R-H-Y-M-E-D. We're looking for 2 words, and it is the name given to the malicious alter ego in Robert Louis Stevenson's 1886 novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll. Oh, Claire?
Mr. Hyde.
Yes, Mr. Hyde, you got it. Oh, well done. I had a lot of fun coming up with those and the clues. Thanks, guys, for the recommendations. I think I'm going to pick up The Woman in Black next for my October read.
Highly recommend it. It's very, very good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
That's all from us, but we want to hear from you. Specifically, we want to hear about the best book you've read lately, and most importantly, what you loved about it. It can be any kind of book, any genre, any format. Find us on Facebook at Listening Books 12 or Twitter at Listening Books, and leave us a tweet or comment. Speaking of social media, Abby Jaggers, our social media manager, is with us on our next episode to take a closer look at author Mary Shelley and her remarkable creation, Frankenstein, which turned 200 earlier this year.
No one is more goth than Mary Shelley.
That'll be in your feed later this month. If you like this podcast, you can help others find it by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Voluminous is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity providing audiobooks for people who have difficulty reading print, whether that's because of illness, disability, learning, or mental health. If that's you or someone you know, you can find out how to access the more than 7,500 titles in our Listening Books library by heading to listening-books.org.uk.
Absolutely nobody is more goth than Mary Shelley!